Imagine a pamphlet, no more than 30 pages, arriving in your hands in the spring of 1614. Imagine opening it in the amber glow of candlelight, the paper slightly rough, the Latin unfamiliar but compelling, and finding yourself reading words that claim to announce the existence of a secret brotherhood, a brotherhood that has been waiting, watching, and is now, for the first time, speaking directly to you. What would you feel in that moment? That almost breathless vertigo of being chosen, or admitted into something vast and hidden. That is precisely what hundreds of educated Europeans felt when the Fama Fraternitatis, the fame of the Brotherhood, first circulated from the German printing houses. And here is the deeper mystery, the one that will pull at us throughout this entire unfolding. An order that announced itself so boldly to the world would then vanish so completely that centuries later, we still cannot say with certainty whether it ever truly existed at all. If you find yourself drawn to the paradox of invisible influence, to the stories of movements that shaped thought without leaving fingerprints, then I invite you to stay for the full telling of this documentary, The Rosicrucians, the entire story of the order that announced itself and vanished. Subscribe now, and we will trace this mystery together, from its first whispered declaration through the centuries it has echoed in shadow. The year is 1614. We are in a candlelit study somewhere in the German Rhineland, though we cannot be entirely certain which room, in which house, by which hand. Quills scratch across paper. The ink is still wet. Outside, autumn is turning the leaves the color of old copper, and the world beyond these walls is fractured. The Reformation has split Christendom like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward in violence and certainty. Plague has returned again and again, thinning the populations of cities and villages. Religious wars simmer and will soon boil into a consuming conflict that will devastate the German territories for 30 years. There is a hunger in the air, a hunger not for weapons or conquest, but for meaning, for hidden knowledge, for the possibility that somewhere, someone understands what has gone wrong with the world and knows the way to put it right. And into this hunger steps a voice, or many voices, speaking as one. The pamphlet that appears is titled Allgemeine und Generalreformation der ganzen Welt, the universal and general reformation of the whole world, though it is the appendix, the true revelation that follows, that will transform everything. That appendix is the Fama Fraternitatis, the fame, the report, the word of mouth that will begin to spread across Europe like a fever of curiosity and hope. The document is not written as a straightforward announcement. It unfolds more like a confession, a legend, almost a prayer. It tells of a man named Christian Rosenkreuz, Christian Rosecross, a cryptic name itself, hinting at both Christian redemption and the symbols of alchemy and mysticism. The text claims that this man, born in the 14th century, became dissatisfied with the learning of his time. So he traveled. He journeyed to Damascus, to Fez, to mysterious academies in distant lands, where ancient wisdom was still preserved and taught. He learned the secrets of nature, the hidden correspondences between the material and spiritual worlds, the languages of birds and stones. And when he returned to Europe, he gathered around him a small circle of companions, a brotherhood bound not by vows written in a charter or registered with any earthly authority, but by a sacred commitment to healing and transformation. The Fama tells us that this brotherhood, the Rosicrucian order, had been working in secret for centuries, invisible, untraceable, yet guiding events, inspiring thinkers, preparing humanity for a great spiritual awakening. And now, the document suggests, the time has come. The brotherhood is ready to reveal itself. It is ready to make contact with those who are ready to hear. Anyone who is sincere, anyone who has pursued wisdom, anyone who has asked the deeper questions, they should respond. They should write. The order, it seems to suggest, is waiting to hear from you. The effect was electric. Imagine being a scholar in 1614. Imagine having spent your life in earnest pursuit of secret knowledge, the Hermetic texts, the alchemical treatises, the whispered traditions of the Kabbalah and the Neoplatonists. And then suddenly there appears a document claiming that the very thing you have been seeking, a real, living, organized brotherhood of enlightened individuals, actually exists, that it is not merely a dream of the ancients or a fantasy spun in lonely libraries, that it is real, that it is among you. Letters began to arrive at printers' shops. Scholars wrote to booksellers asking how to contact the brotherhood. Learned men spent their evenings trying to decode hidden messages in the Pharma, believing that the real address, the true method of contact, must be concealed within the text itself. Some offered their services. Some offered their fortunes. All wanted to know, where are you? How do we find you? When will you acknowledge us? The silence that followed was profound. No address, no response, no pamphlet arrived at the doorstep of the hopeful seekers. The brotherhood, if it existed, was not answering, and yet the mystery deepened, because the mystery itself became irresistible. What kind of order would announce itself and then vanish? What kind of brotherhood would invite contact and then remain forever unreachable? Was it a test? Was it a hoax? Was it a profound spiritual truth disguised as a riddle? The questions multiplied, the legend deepened, and across Europe, in the years that followed, the Rosicrucian mystery would become something far more powerful than any actual organization could ever be. It would become an idea, and ideas, as we will discover, can shape the world in ways that organized institutions never can. They can survive centuries. They can inspire movements that have no connection to their origin, and yet feel, somehow, like a return to something true and ancient. But that transformation was still ahead. In 1614, in that candlelit study, someone, or perhaps several someones, had set in motion a story that would outlive empires. Someone had written a mystery that would never be solved. And the world, hungry and seeking, was about to begin its long, patient attempt to find an answer that may never have existed except in the human longing for it. What would it mean if an entire secret society announced itself to the world, and then, when people came looking, was nowhere to be found? That peculiar inversion of secrecy lies at the very heart of the Rosicrucian mystery, and it's worth sitting with that strangeness for a moment. Most hidden orders prefer invisibility. They work in shadow, recruit quietly, guard their membership lists like alchemists guarded their formulas. But the Rosicrucians, if such an order truly existed, did something far more audacious and deeply more enigmatic. They published, they distributed manifestos, they announced their existence across the reading centers of Europe, and then, almost immediately, seemed to dissolve into the very ether their symbols promised to command. Picture, if you will, the experience of a scholar in Prague or Amsterdam in the early 17th century, opening a pamphlet that promised to reveal the workings of a hidden brotherhood of enlightened men, men who claimed to have penetrated the secrets of nature and spirit, who said they were present in the world but invisible, who invited the wise to seek them out. Imagine the mixture of excitement and bewilderment that must have followed. Here was proof of what you suspected, that behind the visible order of things, behind the churches and universities and courts, there moved a current of deeper knowledge, and here was a direct appeal to you, the reader, to join that stream. But then the silence began. Letters written to mysterious addresses went unanswered. Seekers traveled to the cities named in the pamphlets and found no headquarters, no elder in waiting, no initiation chamber hidden behind a baker's shop or a printer's stall. Some historians and observers began to wonder, quite reasonably, whether anyone had answered the call because there was no one home, whether the entire enterprise had been a hoax, or a literary fantasy given substance by the printing press, or perhaps something even more subtle, an idea so powerful that it needed no physical institution to validate it. This paradox, the order that announced itself and then vanished, becomes even more intriguing when you consider that it may never have been about buildings or robes or secret handshakes at all. The Rosicrucians might have been testing something else entirely, the power of a symbol, the hunger of the human mind for hidden meaning, the way that words on a page could create a current of belief and seeking that would outlast empires, an announcement that summoned seekers not to a place, but to a quest. If this fascinates you, if you find yourself drawn to the puzzle of how a secret society became famous for its invisibility, and how its influence spread precisely because it could not be definitively found or refuted, you might want to subscribe and follow the full unfolding of this story, the true history behind the legend, the real people who may have written these strange documents, the way their vision rippled across centuries and shaped movements they never formally joined. Because what you're about to discover is that the mystery of the Rosicrucians isn't solved by finding them. It's deepened by understanding the world they emerged from, a Europe fractured by religious war, haunted by plague, dazzled and terrified by rapid change. It's a world that was hungry for the very thing these manifestos promised, a path to hidden wisdom, a brotherhood of enlightened minds, a method for transforming base matter into gold, and, more importantly, transforming the human soul itself. The real question, perhaps, is not whether the Rosicrucians existed as a tangible order with membership rosters and meeting halls. The real question is whether an idea, once fully formed and released into the world through the power of print, can be more real, more alive, and more transformative than any institution of flesh and stone. And that's the thread we'll be following as we step back into 17th century Europe, into a moment of extraordinary ferment and hope, where a handful of people, or perhaps a single visionary, chose to light a fire by announcing it, rather than hiding it. For now, though, let your mind rest in that opening paradox, a brotherhood that made itself known by remaining unknown, that called out across the centuries for seekers who would never find them standing at a door, but might instead find them everywhere, in the whispered conversations of scholars, in the symbols of later societies, in the persistent human longing to believe that wisdom moves through the world in ways we cannot quite see, but somehow always feel. To understand why these pamphlets could have such electric effect when they arrived, one must first feel the tremor running through the Europe into which they fell. The continent in the early 17th century was not a stable ground but a cracked, shifting landscape, wounded by centuries of religious fracture, haunted by plague, and now convulsing in wars whose scale would reshape the map itself. For more than 100 years, since Luther's hammer struck Wittenberg's cathedral door, Christendom had been tearing along its fault lines. The Reformation had not merely split the Church, it had fractured the unified worldview that had held medieval Europe together. Where once there had been one voice speaking from Rome, now there were hundreds, each claiming access to truth, each questioning the old certainties. Kings and princes took sides, popes excommunicated, entire regions burned. And beneath this religious upheaval ran a peculiar current of hunger, a hunger for something deeper than doctrinal argument, something hidden and healing that the established churches seemed no longer to possess. The plague, that ancient guest who visited Europe in waves, had left its own particular scar on the collective mind. The Black Death had returned again and again throughout the late medieval period and into the early modern era, each outbreak reminding people that the clergy's prayers offered no protection, that medical knowledge was merely guesswork, that perhaps the wisdom people needed lay not in the institutions above them, but in secret streams of knowledge, ancient, hermetic, passed from sage to sage in whispers and in coded texts. Disease plants a seed of doubt. It makes one ask, what is known that we are not being told? And then, beginning in the late 16th century and gathering terrible momentum toward the moment of our story, came the wars. Religious war, political war, dynastic war, all tangled together into a single grinding machine of human misery. The continent watched as neighbor turned against neighbor. Armies moved across territories. Cities were starved into surrender. Whole populations were displaced, refugees flowing from one region to another, each carrying stories of atrocity, each spreading the sense that the old order was collapsing, that nothing could be trusted anymore. In this atmosphere of fracture and fear, there arose an unusual hunger, It was not the hunger of the devout for certainty. There were plenty of those, and they found their answers in their chosen faith. Rather, it was the hunger of the educated, the thinking classes, the learned men who had studied enough to know how much they did not understand. These were physicians and mathematicians, printers and theologians, courtiers and alchemists. They were men, almost entirely men in this era, who had access to books, who read multiple languages, who could compare texts and find contradictions. What were they looking for? Something older than Christianity, older even than Rome. They sought the Prisca Magia, the ancient magic, the original wisdom that, they believed, had been preserved in fragments and symbols through the ages. They read Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary Egyptian sage whose writings, newly translated from Greek, seemed to contain cosmological secrets. They studied the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, certain that its intricate system of correspondences and divine names held mathematical truths about the universe. They experimented with alchemy, not merely trying to transmute lead into gold, but seeking through the transformation of matter, a spiritual transformation of their own souls. This was the intellectual soil in which the Rosicrucian idea would be planted. It was fertile, precisely because so many established structures had become suspect. If the church could be wrong, if the physicians could be wrong, if kings could order the slaughter of entire towns based on theological disagreement, then perhaps truth had to be sought elsewhere, in hidden schools, in private correspondence, in brotherhoods that admitted only the worthy and kept their wisdom from the profane masses. But why would such seekers respond with such fervor when these pamphlets appeared, claiming to represent an invisible order? Consider, the very invisibility became a virtue, an order that could not be found, that left no institutional traces, that addressed itself to the inner circle of true seekers. Such an order could promise something that no established institution could deliver. It could promise authenticity. It could promise that you, the reader, might be one of the worthy. It could suggest that the very searching itself was a form of initiation. The Rosicrucian manifestos came, then, not into a skeptical vacuum, but into a world made tender by disappointment, made curious by hidden knowledge, made desperate by the collapse of old certainties. They came into a Europe where learned men spent their nights with alchemical vessels and mystical diagrams, where the boundaries between scholarship and magic were still blurred, where the notion that there existed somewhere a college of illuminated sages seemed not absurd but almost necessary, something the fractured age required, even if no one could prove it existed. In the shadows of the 30 Years' War's encroaching horrors, in the candlelit studies of scholars who had lost faith in official knowledge, the stage was set for something unprecedented, a literature of initiation, a text of mystery that would announce itself and then vanish, leaving generations to wonder if they had been reading philosophy, or hoax, or prophecy, or all three at once. The hunger for what was hidden had never been keener, and soon a pamphlet would appear that seemed to speak directly to that hunger, in the language the age most wished to hear. In the spring of 1614, a curious little pamphlet began circulating through the printing houses and scholarly circles of Frankfurt. It was not particularly long. It did not announce itself with trumpets or official seals. It simply appeared, almost as if it had always been waiting there, like a letter finally delivered after centuries of being lost in the post, and its title was Fama Fraternitatis, the fame or report of the fraternity, and what it claimed would set off a tremor through the intellectual world that would not fully settle for generations. The Fama told of a secret brotherhood, a hidden order of wise men and women that had existed in darkness for centuries, quietly perfecting the arts of healing, of transmutation, of seeing through nature's deepest veils. It spoke of a founder, named Christian Rosenkreuz, a man whose name blended Christianity with the rose and the cross, symbols so loaded with meaning that scholars are still unpacking them now. The pamphlet announced, with a directness that was almost bewildering in its audacity, that this order had decided, after long ages of silence, to make itself known, not to reveal its members, not to accept every supplicant who called, but to let the world know that it existed, that it was watching, that seekers with pure hearts and questioning minds might, if they proved worthy, find a way to join. The effect was immediate and electric. Here was a claim so specific, so detailed, so wrapped in the language of genuine authority, that it could not be easily dismissed as mere fancy or the ranting of a single dreamer. The Farmer was printed in German, making it accessible not just to university scholars fluent in Latin, but to educated merchants, physicians, apothecaries, and printers themselves. Word spread from Frankfurt to Leipzig, from Leipzig to Amsterdam, where the Dutch, with their vibrant print culture and their appetite for heterodox ideas, seized upon it hungrily. Within a year, multiple editions were circulating. Latin translations followed, spreading the news into international scholarly networks. The pamphlet was reprinted, discussed, copied by hand, debated in taverns where learned men gathered. And what made people take it seriously? What gave it a weight that, say, an obvious hoax would not have possessed, was its plausibility. The scholarly world of early 17th century Europe was not a place of certainty and settled answers. The Reformation had fractured religious authority. The discoveries of Copernicus and Galileo had begun to crack the old certainties about the cosmos. Alchemy was still being pursued by serious minds, not yet wholly relegated to charlatans. The Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, was being studied intensely by Christian scholars, hungry for hidden wisdom that might unlock divine secrets. Hermeticism, the teachings attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, had recently been recovered and printed, and it spoke of a cosmos animated by divine wisdom, accessible through study and inner transformation. Into this world of fervent inquiry and spiritual hunger, the Farmer arrived like a letter from someone you had been hoping, unconsciously, might write to you. The document itself was crafted with care. It did not make claims that seemed outrageous on their face. It did not promise instant enlightenment or the ability to turn lead to gold tomorrow morning. Instead, it told a story, a narrative of a learned man, a pilgrim of wisdom, who had spent years gathering knowledge from the East, who had founded a brotherhood dedicated to healing sickness without payment, to understanding the hidden harmonies of creation, to serving humanity quietly. The order, it said, had members scattered across Europe. They wore no special robes that would mark them in the street. They lived ordinary lives while pursuing extraordinary knowledge. And now, the document suggested with a kind of tantalizing vagueness, they were opening a door, just slightly, to see who would notice, to see who would care enough to try to answer. Scholars began to respond almost immediately. A physician in Paris found himself wondering if he might be one of the chosen seekers. A Protestant theologian in Strasbourg began trying to calculate, from the clues in the text, where the order's headquarters might be. Printers who specialized in arcane and mystical texts saw in the Farmer both a genuine document of great importance and an opportunity. If it was genuine, they would be printing a historical artifact. If it was a hoax, it was a brilliant and fascinating one, and either way, it would sell. The document had been timed well. It arrived in a moment when Europe was hungry for hope, for hidden knowledge, for the sense that behind the chaos of religious war and theological disputation, there was a deeper harmony being guarded by wise men. The pamphlet also arrived in a moment of acute cultural anxiety. The 30 Years' War was already casting its shadow, though few could have predicted just how long and how terrible it would become. Protestant and Catholic powers were maneuvering. The old medieval synthesis, in which the Church had provided a unifying framework for understanding the world, was broken, perhaps irreparably. Into that gap poured an intense longing for a hidden tradition, a secret wisdom that transcended the bitter divisions of the day, a fellowship of minds dedicated to something higher than sectarian argument. Farmer, whether intentionally or not, spoke to that longing directly. And here is what makes the story particularly poignant to contemplate. No one could verify the truth of the claims. The order had announced itself, yes, but it had done so in a way that made verification impossible. If someone claimed to have encountered a member of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, how would you know if they were telling the truth? If the order's members were scattered and silent, how could you ever be sure you were speaking to one of them? The farmer had created a perfect philosophical puzzle, a claim that could neither be conclusively proved nor conclusively disproven, and this very impossibility, paradoxically, made it more compelling to many minds, not less. Printers began to receive inquiries from people asking where they might send letters of petition to this mysterious brotherhood. Some printers, sensing an opportunity, began publishing follow-up texts, elaborations, defenses of the farmer against those who dismissed it as hoax. The literary response became, almost immediately, a kind of movement. What had begun as a single anonymous pamphlet had kindled something larger, a conversation, a search, a cultural moment in which thousands of educated Europeans found themselves asking the same question: could this be true? And if so, how might one find the way in? Now, at the heart of those manifestos lay a figure so singular, so layered with symbol and possibly memory, that he became the very anchor of everything the Rosicrucians claimed to be. His name was Christian Rosenkreuz, and though no one could prove he had ever lived, hundreds of learned minds began to construct his biography from the scraps and riddles the pamphlets had scattered across the page. According to the Fama Fraternitatis, Christian Rosenkreuz was born in the year 1378 to a family of modest means in Germany. An orphan by early childhood, he was taken in by a monastery and given an education that opened to him not only Christian doctrine, but also Latin, Arabic, and the languages through which ancient wisdom flowed like underground rivers beneath the surface of European knowledge. Here is where the story begins to shimmer with that peculiar light that separates history from legend. The young Rosenkreuz, we are told, became obsessed with a single, burning question. Was there a hidden harmony beneath all human understanding? Could the secrets held by the ancients, the Egyptians, the Persians, the scholars of the East, be reconciled with the truths of Christ? This hunger could not be satisfied by monastery walls or the books that lined its shelves. So, in his early 20s, Rosenkreuz is said to have set out on a journey that would take him across the Mediterranean, through the deserts of North Africa, and deep into the learning centers of the Islamic world. The manifestos describe him traveling first to Damascus, that ancient city where East and West have always met like currents in a river. There, we are told, he encountered masters of secret knowledge, men who had preserved teachings that traced back through centuries of transmission, occult philosophy, the mysteries of numbers and letters, the hidden properties of plants and minerals. Whether this was historical fact or carefully woven fiction, the effect on his listeners was electric. Damascus represented not merely a city on a map, but a threshold into worlds of understanding that Christian Europe believed it had been denied. From Damascus, the narrative carries Rosenkreuz southward to Fez, in Morocco, a city renowned throughout the medieval world as a center of learning where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars had once walked the same streets. Fez in the 14th century was a living library. Its scholars possessed Arabic texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and alchemy, knowledge that European universities were only beginning to glimpse through Latin translations. In Fez, according to the Fama, Rosenkreuz studied for some years, absorbing the Hermetic philosophy and the Kabbalistic traditions that had found their way into North Africa through centuries of Jewish and Islamic scholarship. He mastered, the story suggests, not merely intellectual systems but practical arts, the transmutation of matter through alchemical knowledge, the healing properties of plants, the correspondences between the stars and the human soul. There is a peculiar tenderness in how the manifestos speak of these journeys. They do not read as desperate quests for magical power, but rather as patient, methodical pilgrimages toward truth. Rosenkreuz, as portrayed in these accounts, appears as a kind of spiritual adventurer, humble and sincere, moving through these centers of learning with an almost monastic dedication. He was not, the texts assure us, seeking personal glory or supernatural abilities for their own sake. Rather, he was gathering fragments of wisdom scattered across the world, pieces of a grand design that he believed could be reassembled and understood. The journeys continue further still, beyond even the reaches of the Islamic world. Some versions of the tale speak of Rosicrucians traveling to Egypt itself, to the Valley of the Kings, where he sought communion with the ancient mysteries that had flourished along the Nile thousands of years before. Others hint at journeys to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, where he hoped to reconcile the spiritual wisdom of Christianity with the deeper esoteric teachings that preceded it. In all of these journeys, there is an implicit understanding that the Europe Rosicrucians had left behind was incomplete, that its Christianity, however sincere, had lost touch with the prismatic totality of divine wisdom. What becomes clear, as one contemplates these narratives, is that the figure of Christian Rosicrucians served a function far deeper than mere biography. He represented, to the minds of those who read these manifestos in 1614 and beyond, an ideal figure, the perfectly educated man of the future, someone who had woven together the fragmented wisdoms of East and West, of ancient and modern, of material knowledge and spiritual insight. He was a projection of what the Brotherhood itself claimed to embody, a synthesis, a bridge, a living proof that such reconciliation was possible. Yet here rests a profound uncertainty, one that has never quite been resolved. Was Rosicrucians a real historical personage, someone whose travels could be documented, whose teachings could be traced through archives and letters? Or was he, from the very beginning, a symbolic figure, a kind of spiritual archetype dreamed into being by the manifesto writers themselves? Scholars have searched for centuries, examining church records, examining merchant documents, examining every scrap of evidence that might place a real Christian Rosicrucians in Damascus or Fez in the late 1400s, and what they have found is silence. A beautiful, suggestive silence, but silence nonetheless. Some argue that the figure was a thin disguise for a real teacher, perhaps an actual traveler and scholar, whose name and identity were cloaked for protection. Others suggest that Rosicrucians was always intended as a symbolic figure, a mythological embodiment of the Brotherhood's ideals, rather than a historical human being. The ambiguity, in some ways, is precisely the point. For whether Rosicrucians had walked the streets of Fez in the flesh, or existed only in the imagination of careful writers, he served his purpose perfectly. He gave the Brotherhood a pedigree, a chain of wisdom that reached backward through time and outward through space. He provided proof, not of facts, but of plausibility, that such knowledge could exist, that it had existed, and that it might, in the current age, be recovered and shared. A year passed. The Fama Fraternitatis had circulated through the scholarly networks of Europe, copied, debated, printed in multiple editions, and the silence that followed was itself a kind of answer. The curious were waiting, the hopeful were listening. And then, in 1615, another text emerged from the same mysterious quarter, as though the invisible Brotherhood had heard the restless murmuring of its audience and decided to speak once more. The Confessio Fraternitatis arrived like a second letter in a correspondence that seemed to exist only on one side. Where the Fama had introduced the order and recounted its legendary past, the Confessio turned its gaze outward, toward those who had read and wondered. It was both an elaboration and an enigma, a confession, as its title suggested, but a confession that revealed almost nothing of certainty, only the deepest layers of paradox and promise. The order was real, the Confessio seemed to say, and yet it remained unseen. The text moved through a kind of theological and philosophical justification for the Brotherhood's existence. It affirmed the core teachings hinted at in the Fama, that wisdom drawn from nature, from mathematics, from the hidden correspondences between the visible and invisible worlds, could lead not merely to knowledge, but to transformation. The brothers, the Confessio explained, were engaged in a work that transcended the ordinary pursuits of scholarship. They were alchemists of the spirit, practitioners of what they called true magic, the art of seeing through the veil of ordinary perception into the living intelligence beneath all things. Does this not sound, to the listening ear, like a claim almost too grand to be believed? And yet that very impossibility may have been precisely what drew so many to believe it. What made the Confessio particularly maddening to those who sought the order was its simultaneous promise and withdrawal. Yes, it said, the Rosicrucians would reveal themselves to those who were worthy. Yes, wisdom could be obtained. But no, the moment of revelation would not come on demand, nor could it be hurried by impatience or purchased with gold. The text spoke in riddles about the nature of initiation, suggesting that true membership in the brotherhood required not merely intellectual assent, or even financial contribution, but a fundamental reorientation of the soul. One did not simply join the Rosicrucians. Rather, one had to become the kind of person to whom the Rosicrucians might reveal themselves. The Confessio also contained warnings, subtle and pointed, directed at those who might attempt to seek out the order through ordinary means. It hinted that there were false brothers abroad, charlatans who claimed connection to the true fraternity while possessing none of its knowledge or virtue. There were those, the text suggested, who would use the Rosicrucian name to deceive the gullible, to extract money under the pretense of offering initiation. The genuine order, by contrast, had no need to advertise itself beyond these two manifestos. It required no donations. It made no bargains. It simply existed, according to its own incomprehensible laws, waiting for those rare individuals whose inner development had reached the threshold where contact became possible. This formulation, the simultaneous promise and inaccessibility, was almost perfectly designed to perpetuate both faith and futility. For if you sought the order and did not find it, the fault lay not with the order's non-existence, but with your own insufficiency. You had not yet become worthy. Your understanding was still clouded by material concerns or intellectual pride. The order had not rejected you. You had rejected yourself through your own unworthiness. Is there a more elegant trap for the ambitious seeker? And yet it was also, in its way, a deeply philosophical statement about the nature of spiritual knowledge itself. Perhaps genuine wisdom cannot be accessed by those who approach it with grasping, acquisitive hands. Perhaps it reveals itself only to those who have learned to wait with empty palms and an open heart. The Confessio also deepened the metaphysical claims embedded in the Pharma. It spoke more explicitly of the order's engagement with what it called the true light, a gnosis or illumination that went beyond even the Reformed Protestant Christianity that had begun to reshape European religious life. The language here drew heavily on currents of thought that had been flowing through Europe for centuries, ideas that had survived the Church's suppression through the careful preservation of texts, through oral transmission in secret circles, through the work of translators and scholars who kept ancient wisdom alive in monasteries and academies. The Rosicrucians, according to the Confessio, were heirs to these currents. They were the contemporary guardians of knowledge that stretched back through the Renaissance, back through the medieval mystics, back through the Hermetic philosophers of late antiquity, and even further still, into the spiritual sciences of the ancient Near East. The text hinted at connections between the Rosicrucian project and the aims of alchemy, astrology, and what was sometimes called natural magic, the attempt to understand and work with the hidden forces woven into the fabric of creation itself. It suggested, with careful indirectness, that the transformation promised to initiates was not merely psychological or spiritual in some abstract sense, but involved actual operations and practices, techniques that could be learned and applied. What exactly those operations might be, the Confessio did not say. That knowledge, it implied, remained hidden within the order itself, reserved for those who had crossed its invisible threshold. The effect of the Confessio's publication was to intensify the fever that the Pharma had begun to kindle. If anything, the second manifesto deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. It confirmed that the order existed, somewhere, by the act of its own pronouncement, and yet it simultaneously made clear that no amount of searching, no clever argument or impressive credentials, could bring a seeker face to face with the Brotherhood, unless the Brotherhood itself chose the moment of encounter. The Rosicrucians had announced their existence to the world, and in doing so had made themselves simultaneously more real and more impossibly elusive. They had opened a door, in other words, and then disappeared behind it, leaving those outside to puzzle over what lay on the other side, and whether the door had ever truly been open at all. Within months of the farmer's circulation, something unexpected began to unfold across the continent. The manifestos had not simply been read in candlelit studies and university halls. They had been copied, translated, debated in letters, printed and reprinted in Strasbourg and Frankfurt and Amsterdam. And as the text spread, so too did something more curious and human. Thousands of ordinary seekers, alchemists, theologians, and merchants began to write. They wrote to addresses that might harbor the invisible brethren. They wrote to printers and booksellers, hoping somehow their words would reach the right hands. They wrote to friends, to patrons, to anyone who might know the secret entrance to a brotherhood that had, astonishingly, announced its existence and then offered no way to join it. The letters that survive from this period paint an extraordinary picture of hope deferred and yearning met with silence. In the years following 1614 and 1615, there emerged across Protestant Europe an almost palpable hunger. These were not the idle curiosities of parlor mystics alone. Among the seekers were respected scholars, astrologers of renown, physicians experimenting at the boundaries of what would become chemistry, even nobles who wielded considerable influence. All of them seemed to have read something in the manifestos that spoke directly to their deepest convictions, that hidden wisdom was not merely possible, but that it could be recovered, and that there existed somewhere, in some city or monastery or secret meeting house, a group of men who had already recovered it and were waiting for the worthy to discover them. Consider the practical absurdity of what was happening. Here was an order that had published its existence to the world, that had made elaborate claims about its antiquity and its knowledge, that had promised transformation to those who sought it sincerely, and then it had published nothing further. No address, no method of contact, no confirmation, no denial, nothing but the electric silence of an organization that had summoned the attention of Europe and then vanished into the very obscurity it claimed to have transcended. The correspondence that followed reveals a peculiar kind of desperation, though not the frantic kind. These letters were patient, careful, sometimes almost courtly in their approach. Seekers would address their inquiries to the Frankfurt booksellers who had first printed the Farmer, as if the printers themselves might be secret initiates, guards at the threshold of the order. Others wrote to known alchemists and hermeticists, men of learning whose reputations suggested they might have encountered the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, or at least possessed a pathway toward it. Some crafted elaborate responses to the manifestos, publishing their own treatises in hopes that such work might serve as a kind of calling card, an intellectual credential that would attract the notice of the invisible brothers. What is remarkable about these seekers is how seriously they took the challenge. They were not looking for entertainment or a simple answer. Many spent considerable time and expense trying to decode the manifestos, searching them for hidden instructions, for signs that might point toward a real location or a true membership. They formed small circles and discussion groups. They wrote to one another about their interpretations, their theories about where the order might be hiding. In some cases, they even traveled, sometimes great distances, to cities that seemed to hold particular significance in the Rosicrucian story, hoping that pilgrimage itself might reveal what study alone could not. And through all of this, the order never answered. Not once, as far as any historical record shows, did an authentic representative of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood step forward to confirm the identity of a seeker or to admit anyone into formal membership. The silence was absolute. It is worth pausing here to feel the peculiarity of that silence. One might expect an order that had announced itself so boldly to eventually provide some mechanism for contact, some way of distinguishing the genuinely called from the merely curious. Yet the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, if it existed as an actual organization, seemed content to let thousands of hopeful letters go unanswered, to allow the very people who were moved by its message to remain forever on the outside, pressing their faces against a window they could never quite locate. This wave of seekers was not concentrated in any single place. It swept across the German states and into the Low Countries. It reached England and France. Scholars who would later become notable figures in the history of thought found themselves drawn into the Rosicrucian current. There is a famous, though somewhat disputed, story that the philosopher René Descartes himself spent years searching for the Rosicrucians, traveling through Europe in hopes of gaining an audience with the Brotherhood. Whether or not Descartes truly sought them with such deliberate intent, the very fact that such a story became believable says something profound about the magnetism of the movement. Here was a figure of emerging rational influence, a man who would help birth the modern scientific mind, and yet his name became entangled in the legend of a secret order of mystics and alchemists. The letters themselves, when we can read them, often carry a tone of almost innocent desperation. A correspondent might describe a dream that seemed to confirm the existence of the Rosicrucians. Another might detail an alchemical breakthrough and ask whether this might be a sign that he was beginning to walk the path the manifestos described. Some wrote with elaborate courtesy, as if addressing a foreign dignitary whose customs they did not fully understand. Others grew frustrated, accusatory, wondering aloud whether the manifestos were a hoax or a test of faith, whether the order was watching to see who would persist in seeking despite the silence. There is something profoundly moving about this moment in European intellectual history. For perhaps the first time, a literary provocation had created a continent-wide hunger. Words on a page had convinced tens of thousands of people that wisdom was waiting somewhere, that it could be found, if only they asked the right question, knocked on the right door, or proved themselves worthy through sufficient dedication. The fact that the order never revealed itself only seemed to deepen the conviction that it was real. Absence became proof. Silence became eloquence. The refusal to answer became a kind of answer in itself, a test of faith that separated the merely curious from the truly devoted. And so the years accumulated. The 1620s arrived, and the seekers continued to write. The 1630s came, and still the letters went out into the void. Some correspondents eventually turned their attention elsewhere, toward other orders or other mysteries. But many persisted, becoming part of what one might call a shadow community of Rosicrucian devotion. People who had never met one another, spread across Europe, united only by their reading of two manifestos, and their hope that somewhere, an actual order existed to receive them. It was a peculiar fellowship, organized around an invisible center, bound together by faith in something that had never confirmed its own reality, sustained by the very mystery that had called it into being. To understand what the Rosicrucians truly believed they were, and what made their vision so compelling to the minds of early 17th century Europe, we must step backward into the strange, luminous traditions that had been quietly feeding European thought for centuries. The soil from which the rose and cross first sprouted was not new ground. It was ancient earth, tilled and retilled by generations of seekers who believed that hidden knowledge flowed beneath the visible world like an underground river, and that certain symbols, words, and practices could allow a person to touch it. This knowledge came from three ancient tributaries. The first was Hermeticism, a way of understanding the universe that traced its roots back, or so people believed, to an Egyptian sage named Hermes Trismegistus. The very name meant Hermes the thrice great, and by the late medieval period, European scholars had become almost reverently familiar with a collection of texts attributed to him, writings that spoke of divine wisdom, the correspondence between heaven and earth, and the idea that macrocosm and microcosm, the great world and the small, reflected one another in endless mirroring. What if the patterns you observed in the stars above were the same patterns moving through your own blood? What if human beings carried within themselves the entire cosmos in miniature? These were not questions dismissed as foolish in the 1600s. They were questions that animated the thinking of mathematicians, physicians, and princes. The Hermetic vision rested on a principle so simple it seems almost obvious now. Yet it opened entire worlds to Renaissance thinkers, as above, so below. If the macrocosm and the microcosm were truly interconnected, then understanding one meant understanding the other. You could not fully know yourself without knowing the architecture of heaven. You could not read the book of nature without reading it as a divine text. This philosophy had arrived in Western Europe through a remarkable circumstance. In the 15th century, Greek manuscripts of Hermes's writings, thought to be impossibly ancient, though we now know them to have been written sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era, had been brought to Florence. There they were translated into Latin, and they fell into the hands of men like Marsilio Ficino, a Florentine scholar whose hunger for this recovered wisdom was almost desperate. He believed he had touched something lost since antiquity, something closer to the original purity of human understanding. The text spoke to him of a universe alive with meaning, layered with hidden correspondences, waiting for those with eyes to see. Hermeticism gave the Rosicrucians their central intuition, that the universe is not a machine governed by blind laws, but a living scripture written by divine intelligence. Every plant, every mineral, every constellation carried significance. A rose was not merely a rose. It was a symbol of the cosmos, flowering from divine silence. A cross was not merely two lines intersecting, but the balance point where opposites, spirit and matter, masculine and feminine, heaven and earth, achieve momentary union. And then there was alchemy. To hear the word now is often to conjure images of foolish men in dingy laboratories, obsessed with turning lead into gold, pursuing an impossible fantasy. Yet this modern dismissal misses the true heart of alchemy, which was never primarily about metallurgy at all. Alchemy was a symbolic science, a psychological and spiritual technology, clothed in the language of chemistry. When an alchemist spoke of refining base metals into gold, what he often meant, at least at the deeper levels of the tradition, was the refinement of the base and ignorant human soul into a condition of spiritual enlightenment and divine union. The furnace was the heart, the crucible was the self. The philosopher's stone, that legendary substance of perfect purity and power, was the transmuted soul. Can you feel the poetry and the yearning beneath the strange formulae? Here was a tradition that insisted, you are not fixed, you are not bound by birth or circumstance. Through inner work, through the right knowledge and the right practice, you can be remade. You can become something greater than you were. The alchemical texts that circulated in Europe, some attributed to Paracelsus, that great physician and mystic of the 15th century, others anonymous, passed hand to hand and carefully copied by candlelight, spoke of 7 or 9 stages of transformation, of death and resurrection in symbolic form, of trials that purified the seeker. They were written in an intentional obscurity, a cryptic language so dense that a casual reader might see nothing but gibberish, but a prepared mind, one with the right instruction, could decode layers of meaning. This secrecy was not, as skeptics sometimes suggested, mere pretense to justify ignorance. It was deliberate. The knowledge was hidden because it was believed to be dangerous if misunderstood, and sacred if understood rightly. A vulgar mind, such writings claimed, would only misuse such power. The tradition had to protect itself. The third stream that fed into Rosicrucian thought was the Kabbalah, that vast and intricate system of Jewish mysticism that had flourished in medieval Spain and, by the 16th century, had begun to attract the intense attention of Christian scholars. The Kabbalah taught that behind the visible world of creation lay an invisible architecture of divine emanations. 10 spheres, called Sephiroth, connected by 22 paths, described the entire structure of consciousness, divinity, and existence itself. Above all the spheres lay the Absolute, the infinite nothingness from which all being flowed. Below lay the material world, the kingdom of Asaya. In between lay gardens of transcendent meaning. If you could map the paths correctly, if you could understand the structure of the divine names and the numerical patterns hidden in sacred texts, you might ascend from the lower kingdoms toward the upper ones. You might touch the threshold of divinity itself. What made the Kabbalah so fascinating to Christian scholars like Johannes Reuchlin and other Renaissance philosophers was that it offered a systematic framework, almost a map, for understanding how the infinite could manifest in the finite, how spirit could become matter, how the one could become many. It seemed to answer, in careful symbolic language, the deepest questions of theology and philosophy, and critically, it suggested that human consciousness could be trained, through proper practice, to navigate these inner worlds and to participate knowingly in the cosmic drama. These three traditions, Hermetic correspondence, alchemical transformation, and Kabbalistic structure, were not separate rivers. By the 16th and early 17th centuries, they had mingled and merged. A scholar might be simultaneously studying Hermes, Paracelsus, and the Zohar, seeing them as expressions of a single ancient truth, approaching expression through different languages and cultures. They were all pointing, it seemed, toward the same revelation, that human beings are capable of a kind of knowledge forbidden to the ordinary intellect, that the universe is shot through with meaning and malleability, and that through the right practices, the right words, the right inner transformation, one might move from darkness into light. This was the intellectual and spiritual atmosphere into which the Rosicrucian manifestos were released. When the Fama and Confessio spoke of the fraternity's work, when they hinted at esoteric knowledge and hidden transformation, they were not inventing something new from nothing. They were crystallizing something that had been growing in European consciousness for generations, a hunger for a different kind of knowledge, one that treated the whole person as the instrument, that sought not merely intellectual understanding, but spiritual metamorphosis. The rose and the cross became the perfect emblem for this synthesis. The rose symbolizing the blooming of the soul, the growth and unfolding of consciousness, the cross representing the alchemical marriage of opposites, the hermetic principle of correspondence, and the Kabbalistic path of ascent through the worlds of being. How naturally, then, did these ancient streams converge into a river that people could follow, or search for, in the darkness, hoping to find it? Yet even as hundreds of letters streamed toward empty addresses and scholars puzzled over the manifesto's cryptic geometry, a quieter question had begun to settle in the minds of the more perceptive readers, a whisper that grew into something like suspicion. Who, after all, had actually written these pamphlets? Where had they truly originated? For all their claims of secrecy and hidden membership, the Rosicrucian texts had arrived in the world with authors, with publishers, with a traceable material presence, and in that materiality lay a clue. By the middle decades of the 17th century, scholarly attention had begun to focus with increasing intensity on a figure who occupied a peculiar place in the intellectual landscape of Protestant Germany. His name was Johann Valentin Andreae. Born in 1586 in the city of Herrenberg, in Württemberg, Andreae was no obscure mystic prowling the margins of respectability. He was instead a theologian of considerable learning and standing, a man of the established church, someone whose opinions mattered and whose writings circulated among the educated elite. He was ordained. He held positions of responsibility. He was, in many ways, a pillar of Lutheran respectability. Yet Andreae possessed something that set him apart from his more conventional colleagues. He harbored what might be called a literary imagination. He had the gift for allegory, for layered meanings, for the construction of those elaborate symbolic narratives that spoke to the deepest longings of his era. And perhaps most intriguingly, he had connections to some of the very circles and scholars in whose hands the Rosicrucian manifestos had appeared. The evidence was never conclusive, and perhaps that very inconclusiveness was part of what made the puzzle so enduring. There were threads, however, weak threads, some might say, but threads nonetheless. The printing houses where the Fama and the Confessio appeared, these were located in the territories where Andreae maintained his influence. The theological sensibilities reflected in the texts, They bore certain resemblances to ideas he had expressed elsewhere. And in his later years, in conversations and in letters to friends, André would make remarks about having composed certain symbolic works, certain imaginative pieces meant to provoke reflection and reform. He spoke of them as literary exercises, experiments in awakening. The question that began to haunt scholars was this: could one man, working alone or with a small circle of trusted collaborators, have conceived and orchestrated the entire phenomenon? Could a theology student, a pastor, a learned dreamer in Württemberg have written those electrifying proclamations and released them into a Europe that was hungry beyond measure for exactly what they offered? Some historians came to believe precisely that. Others remained unconvinced, arguing that the evidence was too circumstantial, too suggestive without being definitive. But what emerged from this debate was something more nuanced and perhaps more fascinating than simple attribution. The question of authorship revealed something deeper about the nature of the manifestos themselves. For if André was indeed the author, or the primary architect, then the Rosicrucian texts represented something extraordinary, a theological hoax. Not a hoax born of malice, understand, but something far more subtle, a literary provocation, an imaginary order conjured into being, not to deceive for gain, but to inspire. To shake Europe awake from its slumber of religious dogmatism and intellectual ossification, to propose, through the persona of an invisible brotherhood, a vision of what spiritual and philosophical renewal might look like, a kind of mirror held up to the yearning of the age. And what is remarkable is that André never flatly denied this. In his later writings, particularly in a work called the Vita, his own account of his life, he spoke of having composed various allegorical and imaginative works. He was cryptic about their nature and purpose, but he acknowledged their existence. Some scholars, reading between those careful lines, detected something like a confession, a veiled admission that yes, he had been involved in the creation of a fiction, but a fiction with a purpose, a fiction that was meant to be transformative. Think on this for a moment. If the Rosicrucians were indeed invented, imagined into being by the pen of a single learned theologian in the quietness of his study, does that make them less real? Does it diminish the power that they wielded over the European imagination? Or does it instead suggest something else entirely? That some ideas are so luminous, so perfectly calibrated to the deepest hungers of a particular moment, that they achieve a kind of reality that transcends their origins? The letters continued to arrive, addressed to an order that perhaps never existed except on paper and in the minds of those who read about it. Seekers continued to search for an organization that was purely imaginary, and yet, in searching for it, they found one another. In pursuing this phantom brotherhood, they formed real connections, real philosophical circles, real exchanges of ideas. The very fiction, in other words, had generated a genuine community of inquiry. André himself seems to have observed this unfolding with a mixture of emotions that we can only infer from his sparse records. There is a sense in some of what he wrote of satisfaction, perhaps. The provocation had worked, but there may also have been elements of concern. The phenomenon had escaped his control. It had grown beyond anything he might have foreseen or intended. What began as a literary gesture had transformed into a movement. The shadow on the wall had begun to cast shadows of its own, and so the question of who wrote the manifestos became tangled with another, deeper question. What had the author actually wanted to achieve? Was André trying to establish a real order that would later reveal itself, gathering the most sincere and capable seekers through this elaborate test of faith and persistence? Or was he instead performing a kind of philosophical theater, knowing full well that the order was fictional, but trusting that the fiction itself would be valuable, that the search for something imaginary would teach people more than the discovery of something real ever could? These questions would echo through the subsequent centuries. They would spawn their own literature, their own investigations, and in doing so, they would preserve the essential mystery that lay at the heart of the Rosicrucian phenomenon. For even if we could prove tomorrow that André was the author, even if we could produce his manuscript in his own hand, Would we have answered the fundamental riddle, or would we only have deepened it? In the years following the manifestos, a third and perhaps strangest text emerged from the shadows of Rosicrucian literature, a work that has puzzled scholars and dreamers ever since. It appeared in 1616, attributed once again to Christian Rosenkreutz himself, and it took the form not of a straightforward declaration or confession, but of an elaborate dream narrative, a strange, symbolic journey that wove together the language of alchemy, courtly romance, and spiritual transformation into something that read less like instruction and more like a fever dream, translated into careful prose. This was the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, and within its pages lay perhaps the deepest mystery of all, for unlike the manifestos that promised to reveal the Brotherhood's existence, the chemical wedding seemed designed to conceal as much as it illuminated, speaking in riddles within riddles, each symbol pointing toward truths that could never quite be grasped directly. The story itself unfolds with the languid precision of a medieval romance transplanted into an age of hidden knowledge. Christian Rosenkreutz, we are told, is summoned by a messenger, a woman crowned and radiant, bearing a golden seal, to attend a royal wedding of extraordinary significance. What follows is a 7-day journey through a landscape that is simultaneously real and imagined, a castle that seems to exist in multiple dimensions at once, filled with chambers and gardens and monuments that each contain hidden meanings. There are scales for weighing the souls of guests. There are trials of worthiness. There are chambers where lead is transformed into gold, where bodies are dismembered and reassembled, where the very boundaries between death and resurrection seem to dissolve into something neither state quite captures. And at the heart of it all is the wedding itself, the mystical union of a king and queen that is portrayed not as mere human coupling, but as the cosmic marriage of masculine and feminine principles, of spirit and matter, of the eternal and the temporal, achieving some impossible reconciliation. For those who have studied alchemy deeply, certain symbols within the chemical wedding sing with a clarity that borders on ecstasy. The king and queen themselves represent the philosophical mercury and philosophical sulfur of the alchemical great work, the two principles whose union creates the philosopher's stone. The transformation of metals into gold throughout the narrative mirrors not the external transmutation that charlatans promise to greedy nobles, but rather the internal alchemical transformation of the human soul itself, the purification and elevation of base human nature into something radiant and incorruptible. The dismemberment scenes, gruesome as they seem to modern sensibilities, speak to the alchemical language of putrefaction and dissolution that must precede rebirth, the breaking down of the self that allows for genuine reconstruction. And the wedding at the center is perhaps the ultimate alchemical symbol, the perfect union, the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage of opposites that produces wholeness where there was division. But here emerges the peculiar genius of the text, and perhaps its most maddening feature. The chemical wedding is not written as a prescription or manual that the reader might follow step by step. It is a narrative, a vision, a waking dream in which every element is encoded. Even modern scholars who have devoted years to its study admit that the text seems to resist clear interpretation, that different readers find different meanings in the same passages, that the book appears to generate new interpretations with each reading rather than settling into a single, fixed truth. This may have been entirely intentional. Perhaps the chemical wedding was meant to be a mirror in which each seeker might see their own inner work reflected back, a text that teaches not through explicit instruction, but through provocation, through the creation of confusion and wonder that forces the reader to generate their own meaning rather than passively receiving it. In this way, the book itself becomes an initiatory experience, not because it contains encoded secrets, but because it forces the consciousness of the reader to engage in the very transformation it describes. Consider the 7 days of the wedding, each a separate phase of the unfolding mystery. On the first day, Christian Rosenkreutz arrives at the castle and witnesses scenes of magnificent beauty, interspersed with scenes of decay and death. On the second day, He participates in elaborate processions and encounters the graves of ancient kings. By the third day, he finds himself ascending into higher chambers where the very nature of reality seems to shift. And so on. Each day a deepening, an intensification, a peeling away of layers, until, by the seventh day, the protagonist himself stands transformed, no longer merely a witness, but a participant in the very marriage he has been observing. Is this a description of mystical experience itself, the gradual initiation into higher states of consciousness? Many have thought so. Others have suggested that the 7 days correspond to the 7 traditional planetary alchemical operations, or the 7 classical planets themselves, or the 7 sacred letters of the divine name, or 100 other sevenfold systems known to Renaissance occultism. What remains certain is that the chemical wedding differs fundamentally in tone and intention from its predecessor manifestos. The Pharma and Confessio promise revelation, promise answers, promise that somewhere a brotherhood exists with genuine secret knowledge to impart. But the chemical wedding seems to whisper something quieter, something more complex, that the real transformation cannot be given, cannot be handed from one person to another, like a trinket or a formula. Instead, it must be enacted within, lived through, in the theater of consciousness, where each person's wedding is ultimately their own. The book offers no membership, no passwords, no proof of the brotherhood's existence. Instead, it offers only the possibility that enlightenment is not something to be acquired from external authorities, but something to be cultivated within, through a kind of internal alchemy that no printed page could ever fully capture. In this way, perhaps, the chemical wedding achieves something that the manifestos, for all their tantalizing promises, could never quite accomplish. The manifestos provoke, they create desire, they make the reader long for contact with something hidden, something just beyond reach, but the chemical wedding transforms that longing into a tool. It suggests, with extraordinary subtlety, that the true quest is not external, not the search for a hidden brotherhood that may or may not exist, but internal. The marriage one seeks is not the marriage of a king and queen in some castle in some twilight realm, but the marriage within oneself, the wedding of conscious and unconscious, of intellect and intuition, of the self as it is and the self as it might become. And so the chemical wedding stands as perhaps the most enigmatic document in all of Rosicrucian literature, a text that seems designed to generate endless interpretation rather than settle any questions. It is a book that invites being reread, that changes with each encounter, that seems to contain more mysteries the more one studies it rather than fewer. For the seekers of the early 17th century, those who received copies as they circulated through Europe's networks of learning, it presented both a profound disappointment and a profound opportunity. Disappointment, because it offered no clear secrets and no clear path to contact the supposed brotherhood. Opportunity, because it suggested that perhaps the entire quest itself had been misunderstood, that the Rosicrucian wisdom was not something to be discovered in the external world, but something to be cultivated, discovered, awakened within the depths of one's own being, in that secret chamber where the true marriage takes place, in the darkness and silence where transformation, if it comes at all, moves at its own pace. Beyond the manifestos and their circulation through printing houses, something was stirring in the political landscape of Europe that would give the Rosicrucian dream a peculiar and vulnerable hope. There existed, at the turn of the 1620s, a young Calvinist prince whose name and destiny would become entangled with whispers of the invisible college, Frederick V, Elector Palatine, a man barely 20 years old when the weight of Protestant renewal seemed to rest upon his shoulders. His story, and the story of those who wondered if Rosicrucian wisdom might guide his reign, carries a strange and melancholic beauty, as if an entire continent held its breath, waiting for philosophy to become politics. The Protestant cause across Central Europe had endured centuries of pressure, of compromise, of hope deferred. Religious war had carved the continent into territories of faith and geography, and yet there remained a burning desire among Reformed Christians, not merely to survive, but to imagine a renaissance of their own, a new flowering of both spiritual and intellectual light. Frederick V represented something almost mythic to these dreamers, a young prince of significant territory, educated, philosophically inclined, married to Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of the English king. Through marriage to the Palatinate, an English Protestant princess might help anchor a renewed Protestant empire. It seemed, to those with hunger enough to see it, that heaven itself was orchestrating something. And so, among certain circles of learned men and ambitious courtiers, the thought began to take shape. Might not the invisible brotherhood, the legendary Christian Rosicrucians and his heirs, be revealed or at least consulted at Frederick's court? Might not a prince sympathetic to Hermetic reform, to the marriage of ancient wisdom and Protestant theology, actually implement the great transformation that the Fama and Confessio had promised? The very notion carried an intoxicating power. It suggested that the manifestos were not merely philosophical entertainment, not merely paper dreams, but an actual roadmap, and that someone in the real world of crowns and courts might be willing to walk it. Some scholars have traced the Rosicrucian fever at the Palatinate court quite explicitly. The elector was surrounded by men of learning, theologians, alchemists, mathematicians, occultists, and among them circulated not only the manifestos themselves, but the passionate letters of inquiry, the elaborate theories about the Brotherhood's location and purpose. Theodore Reusner, a learned figure close to Frederick's circle, was said to be actively seeking the Rosicrucians. Others whispered about secret meetings, hidden correspondences, the possibility that the very court of Heidelberg might become a center of Rosicrucian renewal. What if the Winter King, as he would bitterly come to be called, was meant to be the instrument of this new world? Frederick married Elizabeth Stuart in 1613, the very year before the Fama emerged into the light. Whether coincidence or symbolic convergence matters less than the feeling it created, a sense that Protestant renewal and ancient wisdom were arriving together, as if the cosmos itself had orchestrated the timing. The young couple settled in Heidelberg, in the Palatinate, a territory that had already begun to develop a reputation for intellectual openness and religious reform. Here, it seemed, something new might grow, not merely a kingdom, but a commonwealth of enlightened souls. Yet history, in its patient and often devastating way, would render all of this into tragedy. The hope kindled in the early 1620s was already the sound of a match struck in a darkening room. Across the Holy Roman Empire, tensions that had been building for generations were about to ignite into one of the bloodiest conflicts Europe had ever witnessed. The 30 Years' War was gathering its dark momentum, and Frederick, for all his learning and good intentions, would become caught in currents far larger than any philosophy could navigate. In 1619, Frederick accepted the crown of Bohemia, a choice that seemed, to those who believed in the Rosicrucian vision, to be the beginning of a new chapter. Here was a Protestant prince, educated and sympathetic to reform, actually taking the throne, taking on political power. Could the invisible college not reveal itself now? Could the great work not begin? The manifestos had promised that the Brotherhood would emerge when the time was right, when the world was ready. Was this not that moment? If you're drawn to the intersection of hidden knowledge and real-world power, of how ideas attempt to shape history and how history swallows ideas whole, this story deepens considerably, and we invite you to subscribe so that you can follow these threads through their full and tragic unfolding. The answer to that yearning question would come swiftly and brutally. Frederick's reign as King of Bohemia lasted only one winter, scarcely more than a year. By 1620, the forces arrayed against him, the weight of Catholic imperial power, had overwhelmed any possibility of his reformed Protestant vision taking root. He was driven from Prague. He became, in the annals of history and the hearts of those who had believed in him, the Winter King, a figure of pathos and failed potential. His brief moment of power extinguished almost before it had properly kindled. And in that failure, something else died too. Not entirely, not completely, but the hope that Rosicrucian ideals might find shelter in a real court, under a real crown, that they might shape actual politics and actual reform. This hope was buried beneath the gathering catastrophe of war. The manifestos had promised that the Brotherhood would guide history toward transformation. But Frederick's swift downfall suggested another possibility, one that the faithful would have to reconcile themselves to. Perhaps the Rosicrucians' power existed precisely in their invisibility, precisely in their refusal to emerge, precisely in remaining as shadow and suggestion, rather than claiming throne and territory. The thought settles slowly, like autumn leaves drifting through candlelight. Sometimes, the most potent change is the change that happens in the imagination rather than in the palace. Sometimes, the idea outlasts the prince. Yet even as the Fama and Confessio circulated through learned circles and merchant networks, carrying their promises of hidden wisdom and spiritual transformation, the world around them was beginning to darken in ways that would prove far more tangible than any secret cipher. The 1620s arrived with a kind of temporal weight, a feeling that had been building in the provinces and courts of Europe, a heaviness that would soon transform from rumor and unease into something far more violent and consuming. The question that many historians have quietly posed is this: could a brotherhood built on ideals of hidden knowledge and inner illumination survive the roar of armies and the smell of burning towns? In 1618, in a moment that seemed almost designed by fate or by the indifference of history, the Bohemian revolt erupted. The Protestant estates of Bohemia, inspired partly by currents of religious reform and renewal that the Rosicrucian texts themselves had seemed to promise, rose against Habsburg Catholic rule. And Frederick V, the Winter King, that young, idealistic Protestant prince whose court had been a refuge for alchemists, mystics, and scholars who believed the Rosicrucian ideals might find flesh in political reform, accepted the Bohemian crown. For a brief, luminous moment, it seemed possible that the hidden wisdom spoken of in the manifestos might actually reshape Europe, that a prince sympathetic to Hermetic thought, to the marriage of science and spirituality, might govern according to principles that transcended the old Catholic-Protestant divide, that the invisible college might step from shadow into daylight. But kingdoms do not bend to the hopes of mystics, and wars do not honor the dreams of idealists. The 30 Years' War, that grinding, almost unimaginable catastrophe that would eventually claim nearly a third of the population of Central Europe, began not with declarations of Rosicrucian enlightenment, but with the defenestration of Prague and escalating religious violence. Frederick's reign lasted barely a season. By 1620, his armies were broken at the White Mountain, and what might have been a moment of Protestant mystical renewal became instead a cascade of defeat, exile, and the methodical suppression of Protestant culture across the German lands. The prince fled, and with him fled the possibility, or the promise, that Rosicrucian ideals might influence the shape of nations. Consider what this meant for the circulation of those manifestos. The Fama and Confessio had been spreading through carefully maintained networks of printers, scholars, and seekers. They had arrived in universities, been copied in studies, whispered about in the gatherings of learned men. But as armies mobilized and entire regions became theaters of war, those networks fractured. Scholars scattered or died. Printing presses were destroyed. The safe spaces in which mystical texts could be copied and discussed, the courts, the universities, the protected cities, became suddenly, violently unsafe. A man who had been carefully cultivating his correspondence with suspected Rosicrucians might suddenly find himself uncertain whether those correspondents were even alive, or whether his letters might be intercepted by soldiers who cared not for Hermetic wisdom, but only for the possession of weapons and grain. There is something peculiar about watching an idea meet historical force. The Rosicrucian promise had depended on a kind of intellectual intimacy, a sense that knowledge and transformation could occur through study, correspondence, and the gradual circulation of wisdom among receptive minds. It was a movement born in paper and ink, in the quietness of rooms where candles burned over texts. War is the opposite of quiet. War is rupture and severance. It is the breaking of every thread that held a conversation together. As the 1620s deepened into the 1630s, as armies moved across the German principalities again and again, plundering and burning, the entire landscape in which Rosicrucian ideas had been growing began to collapse. The courtly culture that had sheltered alchemists and hermetic thinkers became precarious. Libraries were destroyed. Scholars died or went underground. The optimism that had accompanied the early manifestos, the sense that a new age of spiritual and intellectual renewal was dawning, gave way to something closer to despair. How does one speak of an invisible college when one's own city is occupied? How does one study the transmutation of souls when soldiers are requisitioning food and threatening violence? And yet, there is another dimension to this shadow that fell across Rosicrucian hopes, one that is perhaps even more subtle. The war did not merely interrupt the circulation of the manifestos or scatter those who had been drawn to them. It also, in a peculiar way, transformed what the Rosicrucian mystery meant. Before the war, before the defeat at White Mountain, the Brotherhood, whether real or imagined, had seemed to promise an alternative future, a pathway through which wisdom could reshape the world, a hidden order that worked toward renewal and transformation. But as the war ground on, decade after decade, as it became clear that Protestant ideals were being suppressed and that the old order was reasserting itself across Europe, the Rosicrucian texts began to be read differently. They became less a promise of imminent change and more a consolation for hidden, inner transformation, less a call to manifest a new age and more a whispered promise that wisdom could survive even when the world burned. This shift is worth sitting with for a moment. The manifestos had announced themselves boldly, had called out to whoever was ready to hear them, had promised that a great work was underway. But history had answered not with recognition, but with rupture. And in that rupture, the Rosicrucian ideal transformed into something more metaphorical, more interior. The Brotherhood had announced itself to a world that was prepared, for just a moment, to listen. And then the world caught fire. Yet for all the fervor that seized the continent, a deeper current moved in the opposite direction. Not everyone who encountered the Rosicrucian manifestos believed in them. Not everyone who read of Christian Rosenkreuz's Eastern journeys accepted them as historical truth. Some of the sharpest minds of the age turned toward the question with something closer to skepticism, or perhaps with that peculiar kind of curiosity that delights in exposing what others have chosen to believe. René Descartes, the French philosopher whose methodical doubt would reshape European thought, is said, though the evidence here becomes gossamer thin, a story whispered across centuries, to have spent time in his travels searching for trace of the Rosicrucians. There is no definitive proof, only letters, rumors, and fragments of biographical speculation that suggest he may have sought them out during his wanderings through the German states in the 1620s. Whether this was genuine searching or merely the kind of intellectual curiosity that a restless mind indulges, the historical record will not say. But the image persists. Descartes, the man who would famously doubt everything until he could doubt no longer, moving through the landscape of post-Reformation Europe, perhaps knocking on doors, following whispers, looking for an order that left no trace of itself. Did he believe they existed? Or was he, even then, testing the limits of belief itself, wondering what drew so many intelligent people toward the invisible? By the 1620s and beyond, a wave of satire and mockery had begun to crash against the Rosicrucian fervor. Jesuit writers, eager to discredit what they saw as Protestant mysticism run amok, penned biting critiques. The order became a target not only of religious polemic, but of theatrical ridicule. Comedians and ballad singers made sport of the Rosicrucian seeker, the credulous pilgrim wandering the roads in search of a phantom fraternity, knocking on doors, showing tokens, speaking passwords that fell on unsympathetic ears. There was something almost pitiful about these portraits of the desperate hopeful, and yet there was also an uncomfortable truth embedded in the mockery. The mockery worked precisely because the seekers were real. Their letters were real. Their disappointment was real. A curious phenomenon emerged. The more people claimed the Rosicrucians did not exist, the more others wrote in to insist that they did, or that they themselves had encountered a member, or a representative, or at least a credible account of someone who had. The manifestos had promised that the brothers would reveal themselves to the worthy. Were you worthy? Had you earned their attention? The very absence of evidence became, in the minds of believers, a kind of proof. An order that announces itself and then vanishes has committed a particular kind of seduction. It has said, "We are here," and then by being nowhere, it invites everyone to search, to prove their worthiness, to maintain faith despite the evidence. Some scholars of the period, approaching the manifestos with a more measured eye, began to wonder if the entire affair was a hoax, albeit a hoax of extraordinary literary ambition. What if someone, or a small group of people, had created these texts not as a genuine call to a hidden order, but as a provocation, a test of how far an idea could travel, how readily educated people would accept an appealing fiction, and how persistently the human mind would seek hidden meaning in deliberate obscurity? If that were the case, then the Rosicrucians were not a failed attempt to establish an invisible college, but rather a successful experiment in the power of narrative itself. There were also the satirists who took a different approach. They created their own false Rosicrucian texts, their own manifestos announcing counterorders, parodic brotherhoods with absurd names and impossible promises. Some of these were cruel, designed to mock the gullibility of seekers. Others were playful, participatory in a way that suggested a kind of fond exasperation with the entire phenomenon. The line between satire and sincere mockery grew thin. At what point does someone stop pretending to mock an invisible order and simply become part of the tradition of creating invisible orders? Johann Valentin Andreae himself, as the decades wore on and suspicion increasingly pointed toward him as the author of the manifestos, adopted a curiously ambiguous stance. He neither fully claimed them nor definitively denied them. When pressed, he would suggest that the work was allegorical, a spiritual fable meant to inspire inner transformation rather than outer organization. But this explanation, while plausible and in many ways beautiful, came only after years of the order being searched for, written about, and discussed as though it were an actual secret society. Did Andreae intend this? Was he genuinely surprised by the response? Or had he, in some corner of his mind, known that by creating a sufficiently compelling fiction, he might touch something real in the hunger of his contemporaries? As the 17th century deepened, a strange inversion began. The question was no longer whether the Rosicrucians existed, but why they had not revealed themselves to their many seekers. This shift in the question itself was revealing. It suggested that by this point, many had begun to internalize the possibility of failure. Perhaps the order did exist, but had decided that Europe was not worthy. Perhaps the brothers had withdrawn, disappointed by the fervor and commercialization of their announcement. Perhaps they were watching still, waiting, assessing. The manifestos had promised secrecy and wisdom. Those same promises, when denied fulfillment, became proof of the order's prudence. And so the invisible brotherhood endured, at least in the imagination, partly because of the very fact that no one could prove it did not exist. Absence, paradoxically, became a form of presence. And yet, when the dust of those centuries settled, when the dust itself had turned to dust, the most arresting possibility emerged, not from historical record, not from unearthed documents or aged correspondence, but from silence itself. What if there was no order? What if the Rosicrucians were never meant to be found because they existed solely as a thought, a text, a possibility suspended in the minds of those who read those trembling words in 1614? Consider the strange geometry of this absence. Decades passed, the century ground forward. Wars raged and ended and raged again. Empires shifted, dynasties crumbled. Yet in all that turning, In all the careful investigations by scholars and seekers, and the determined efforts of those who truly believed themselves called to join an invisible brotherhood, no one ever found them, not a roster, not a meeting place, not a single authenticated initiate who could point to a hidden chamber and say, "Here, this was where we gathered. Here is where we learned the secrets of transmutation and the union of the divine self." There is something almost unsettling about such perfect invisibility. An order that leaves no trace is indistinguishable from an order that never existed at all. Yet to say the Rosicrucians were merely fiction, merely a literary game, would be to miss something essential about how ideas move through the world. Ideas, after all, do not require membership rosters or physical headquarters to change the course of human thought. They do not need addresses or initiation fees. They need only to be believed in, spoken about, written into correspondence and debated in coffee houses, and whispered in the studies of natural philosophers and scholars. Consider what the manifestos actually were. They were an invitation and an unanswerable riddle wrapped into one. They promised access to real transformation, to hidden knowledge that genuinely existed, whether we call it Hermetic philosophy, or Kabbalistic insight, or alchemical wisdom, and they promised it through a group that could never be reached, never be verified, never be disproven. It is, in its own way, a perfect form of provocation. The Rosicrucians announced themselves to Europe and then performed an endless disappearance, reappearing only in the fevered imaginings of those who sought them. Some historians now propose what we might call the theatrical theory, that the manifestos themselves were the performance, and the performance was the entire point. A brotherhood of writers, perhaps centered on Johann Valentin Andreae and his circle, or perhaps even more diffuse than that, created a text designed to awaken the imagination, to pose a question that would outlast any answer. They offered a mirror to every seeker's deepest longing for esoteric knowledge, and they did so knowing, or hoping at least, that the very elusiveness of their order would intensify that longing rather than diminish it. There is a peculiar power in an organization that cannot be infiltrated because it does not meet anywhere, an order that cannot be destroyed because it has no physical form, a brotherhood that cannot disappoint through hierarchy or petty politics, or the slow erosion that comes to all human institutions because it exists only in the space between the text and the reader's mind. And so those who looked for the Rosicrucians, Descartes among them, allegedly, though this too remains one of those Renaissance mysteries that historians debate with gentle uncertainty, found instead only the traces of their own desire. They found what the manifestos had planted in their imagination. They found questions that multiplied rather than resolving. They found an order that was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. By the later decades of the 17th century, this interpretation had begun to crystallize in the minds of the most thoughtful observers. Perhaps, they reasoned, the Rosicrucian Brotherhood was always a metaphor, a cipher for the work that each individual seeker must perform upon themselves, the marriage of the soul to divine wisdom, the transmutation of base personality into refined spirit, the journey inward to those hidden chambers where real illumination awaits. If this is true, then the Rosicrucians succeeded spectacularly. They announced their existence. They vanished, and in vanishing, they became eternal. They could not be killed by skeptics' mockery, because they had never been alive in the conventional sense. They could not be dispersed by the 30 Years' War, or by censorship, or by time itself, because they lived in a realm that time could never quite touch. The idea persisted, the symbols endured, the questions they posed, about the possibility of transformation, about the marriage of human consciousness with something larger than itself, about the hidden order beneath apparent chaos. These questions did not fade. They merely transferred themselves into new vessels, took new names, reshaped themselves to fit new eras and new hungers. What if, in their very elusiveness, the Rosicrucians achieved something far more remarkable than any actual order ever could? What if the mystery was not a failure of historical documentation, but a deliberate creation, a work of art that needed never to be completed, because its beauty lay precisely in its incompleteness? And so the silence fell. By the 1640s, when the fires of the 30 Years' War had cooled to embers across the German lands, the Rosicrucian fever that had seized Europe just decades before had begun its long retreat into shadow. The pamphlets still circulated in worn copies, passed hand to hand, their margins crowded now with marginal notes and speculations, but the originals had published nothing new. No further manifestos arrived. No initiated ones came forward to stake a claim on the Brotherhood's inheritance. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the precise memory of what the Rosicrucians were meant to be began to soften and disperse, like smoke curling upward into a darkening sky. The silence itself became part of the mystery. Some interpreters took it as a sign of the Order's retreat into deeper secrecy, a withdrawal so complete that even the searching eyes of the faithful could no longer track them. Others, perhaps more quietly, began to wonder whether the Order had ever truly existed as an organized body at all, whether it had been instead a ghost that announced itself and then willingly became invisible again. Yet what is curious, what lingers in the historical record with an almost stubborn persistence, is that the ideas did not vanish. The symbols did not fade. Instead, something quieter and perhaps more powerful began to unfold. A slow, deliberate absorption of Rosicrucian imagery and philosophy into the broader movements that themselves were reshaping European thought and spirituality. Consider the gentleness with which these borrowed symbols migrated. The rose and cross, which had blazoned the covers of those remarkable pamphlets, began appearing in unexpected places. Engravers and thinkers who may never have contacted a Rosicrucian, or believed they were contacting something more ephemeral, something that existed as pure ideal rather than institutional membership, began to incorporate the emblem into their own work. The rose itself held ancient meaning. It was the symbol of secrecy, whispered in medieval monasteries, etched into the wooden ceilings of guild halls. The cross was perhaps the oldest image of humanity's search for harmony between earth and heaven, matter and spirit. When combined, these elements spoke to something deeper than any single order could claim ownership of. They became a language available to anyone who wished to understand transformation, to seek the hidden within the manifest. In the second half of the 17th century, particularly as the climate of religious intensity began to soften and natural philosophy gained new footing in the intellectual landscape, certain traditions began to recognize themselves in Rosicrucian writings. There were alchemists who reread the references to golden transformation and chemical symbolism and felt a kinship, a sense that perhaps the Rosicrucians had been describing their own pursuits all along. There were Hermetic scholars, men steeped in Neoplatonism and the texts of Hermes Trismegistus, who found in the few surviving Rosicrucian tracts a validation of their conviction that there existed a perennial wisdom, hidden from the masses but accessible to the sufficiently dedicated. There were mystics and quietists, particularly in the orbit of writers like Jacob Boehme, whose visions of divine light and inner illumination resonated with what they imagined the Rosicrucians must have experienced. But what is especially worth noting is how Rosicrucian concepts began to permeate Freemasonry, a fraternity that was itself undergoing profound transformation in precisely this period. Freemasonry, which had begun in the operative guilds of medieval stonemasons, was becoming in the late 17th century a speculative, philosophical organization. Men of learning and leisure were joining the lodges, bringing with them interests in alchemy, hermeticism, and hidden wisdom. Some historians have suggested that the Rosicrucian manifestos exerted a direct influence on Masonic development, offering a template of initiation, secrecy, and spiritual advancement through degrees of illumination. Others note that the two movements, though they may have borrowed from one another, drew from the same deep well of European mystical thought. What seems certain is that by the turn of the 18th century, Masonic ritual and symbolism had woven elements that feel distinctly Rosicrucian in flavor. The idea of transformation through knowledge, the careful progression from darkness to light, the promise that inner work yields outer wisdom. And there is another current worth following, moving more quietly through the century. In the shadow of institutional religion, within the closeted studies of scholars and the small circles of devoted seekers, the Rosicrucian ideal persisted as something almost literary, almost legendary. It lived in the imagination as a provocation, a challenge to the unenlightened world to imagine that somewhere, somehow, a brotherhood of illuminated beings might be working toward the gradual perfection of humanity. The fact that no such brotherhood could be found, that no authoritative voice ever emerged to claim the mantle of the Order of the Rosy Cross, did not diminish its power. If anything, it enhanced it. An invisible order is infinitely more potent than a visible one, because it escapes refutation. It escapes the mundane compromises of institutional life. The silence through these decades was not, then, merely absence. It was more like the silence of a seed beneath soil, or the hush of deep work happening beyond the reach of ordinary perception. The symbols moved through culture like water finding cracks and seeping through them. The ideals, that there could be hidden schools of wisdom, that spiritual advancement was possible through dedication and study, that the cosmos itself was suffused with divine meaning waiting to be deciphered. These convictions found purchase in hearts that had never read the original manifestos, that might never know the name Christian Rosenkreuz, yet felt themselves kindred to whatever impulse had called the Rosicrucians into being in that candlelit moment in early 17th century Germany. By the time the 18th century arrived with its cool rationalist air, the original Rosicrucian brotherhood had long since dissolved into whispers and speculation. Yet something extraordinary happened in the shadow of that silence. The symbols and ideals that had never quite left the European imagination began to gather themselves again in new forms, as if the order's ideas possessed their own persistent life, independent of whether the order itself had ever truly existed at all. It was as though the Rosicrucian current, having disappeared from history, had merely gone underground, waiting for another generation to feel its subtle pull. In Bavaria, in the 1760s, a group of mystics began meeting in secret circles under the name of the Illuminated Order, or the Bavarian Illuminati, and while their public aims were rationalist and enlightened in spirit, their inner teachings drew heavily from the Hermetic and Rosicrucian well. They claimed, or at least hinted, that they possessed the hidden wisdom that the original brotherhood had guarded, a claim impossible to verify, yet deeply appealing to those who longed to believe that such knowledge had survived intact. Whether or not there was genuine connection, the impulse was unmistakable. The hunger for an invisible order of wise ones continued unabated, and the Rosicrucian template provided the perfect mythology through which to express it. But the most direct reappearance came through what became known as the Golden and Rosy Cross, an order that emerged in German-speaking lands around the same period, declaring itself the true heir to the ancient Rosicrucian tradition. The founders and early practitioners of this order, and here the historical record grows somewhat hazy, as was so often the case with these carefully guarded societies, constructed elaborate ritual systems that wove together alchemical symbolism, Kabbalistic knowledge, and Hermetic philosophy, all supposedly restored from genuine Rosicrucian sources. They created degrees of initiation, secret passwords, elaborate ceremonies performed by candlelight in hidden chambers. The rituals were intricate, immensely detailed, designed to move the initiate through stages of spiritual transformation that mirrored the great work of the alchemists. It is worth noting that whether these systems represented an authentic transmission from the original brotherhood, or whether they were inspired reconstructions and creative elaborations, remains genuinely unknowable, and perhaps, as we consider it now in the quiet of these hours, the distinction itself becomes less important than understanding why people felt so compelled to create these structures in the first place. What becomes clear as one examines the historical threads is that Freemasonry, that elaborate system of lodges, degrees, and secret knowledge, which had been developing in parallel throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, began to absorb and integrate Rosicrucian symbolism with remarkable fluidity. Masonic degrees, particularly in certain continental practices, incorporated hermetic and alchemical elements that bore the unmistakable imprint of Rosicrucian thought. The higher degrees of Freemasonry, the degrees of Rose-Croix, the Royal Arch, and others, carried within them imagery and teachings that had previously circulated in Rosicrucian circles. Some historians suggest that Rosicrucian ideas flowed into Masonic practice like water finding cracks in stone, gradually permeating the structure. Others propose that certain Masonic leaders deliberately sought to revive and preserve what they believed were authentic Rosicrucian teachings. The truth likely involves both processes simultaneously, a meeting of two streams that recognize themselves in one another. As the 19th century opened, and the Romantic movement swept across Europe with its hunger for mystery, the irrational, and the hidden dimensions of human experience, Rosicrucian symbolism and teaching experienced a remarkable renaissance. Mystic circles in France, Germany, England, and eventually America began to claim direct descent from the original Brotherhood, or to assert that they possessed access to secret archives, lost manuscripts, or oral traditions that had been carefully preserved through the centuries. Each claimed authenticity. Each presented itself as the genuine continuation, and each, one might observe with a kind of gentle irony, was probably sincere in its belief. The Rosicrucian ideal had become something greater than any single order. It had become a template, a blueprint for how people imagined hidden wisdom ought to be organized and transmitted. In the United States, toward the end of the 19th century, there emerged an organization that would prove to be among the most successful and influential Rosicrucian revival movements, the ancient mystical order Rosicrucis, commonly known as AMORC. Founded by the American occultist Carl Louis von Grashoff, writing under the pen name Max Heindel, though the primary architect of its organizational structure was the engineer Spencer Lewis in the 1915 period, AMORC presented itself as a direct successor to the ancient Brotherhood, claiming to possess methods of instruction, primarily through correspondence courses and printed lessons, that would allow the modern person to access the same spiritual transformation that Christian Rosenkreuz himself had sought. The organization grew rapidly, establishing chapters across America and eventually spreading to Europe and beyond. By the mid-20th century, AMORC had enrolled tens of thousands of members, making it perhaps the largest single organization claiming authentic Rosicrucian descent. What AMORC did, in essence, was to democratize the Rosicrucian promise. Whereas the original Brotherhood had supposedly been a small, carefully selected group of illuminated individuals, AMORC offered its teachings to anyone willing to pay the membership fee and commit to the correspondence course. The lessons arrived in the mail, month after month, outlining meditation practices, visualizations, hermetic principles, and promises of psychic development and spiritual awakening. For many thousands of seekers, particularly in an age before mass access to esoteric knowledge became commonplace, these lessons provided a genuine entry point into worlds of hidden knowledge and mystical practice. Whether or not one believed that AMORC possessed authentic Rosicrucian transmission, it represented a living, tangible organization devoted to the propagation of essentially Rosicrucian ideals and practices. Throughout this long period of revival and reconstitution, something subtle and important was occurring. The original Rosicrucian Brotherhood, that ghostly order announced in 1614 and never definitively found, was being continuously recreated in the minds and hearts of sincere seekers. Each new organization, each revival movement, each group that claimed authentic connection to the ancient Brotherhood was, in a very real sense, answering the original call that the Fama Fraternitatis had issued centuries before. They were not necessarily lies or frauds, though skeptics had good reason to be skeptical. They were, rather, a continuation of the same impulse that had driven people in 1614 and 1615 to write passionate letters to an invisible order, begging for admission to its mysteries. The form changed, the organizations came and went, but the essential hunger remained remarkably constant. By the 20th century, numerous other groups had emerged claiming Rosicrucian heritage. The Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, founded in the 19th century, and drawing heavily on Masonic structures, various Hermetic orders of the Golden Dawn branches and offshoots, and countless smaller organizations, some more scrupulous about historical claims than others. What becomes apparent when one surveys this landscape is that Rosicrucianism had become less a single, clearly defined order and more of a loose constellation of ideas, symbols, and aspirations. It existed as a template, a set of core commitments, the pursuit of hidden knowledge, the belief in spiritual transformation through initiation, the integration of Hermetic and alchemical teaching, the conviction that a secret wisdom existed and could be accessed by the dedicated seeker. And one might pause here to consider what this meant. The original brotherhood, having announced itself and then vanished, had left behind something perhaps more powerful than any organization could have been, a living legend, a set of unanswered questions, a space into which the aspirations of countless seekers could flow. Every revival movement, every new order claiming Rosicrucian heritage, was participating in the same fundamental act, keeping alive the conviction that such wisdom existed, that hidden schools of learning persisted despite the skepticism of the rationalist age, that within the ordinary world there existed hidden dimensions accessible to those with sufficient dedication and purity of purpose. In this sense, the original Rosicrucians had achieved something quite remarkable. They had planted an idea in the soil of European consciousness, and that idea had continued to germinate and flower for centuries after the original planters had faded from view, nourished by the eternal human hunger for mystery and transcendence. And so we arrive at the quiet end of a story that may never have truly had a beginning, or perhaps it had thousands of them, each carried in the heart of someone who read those manifestos by candlelight, convinced they had glimpsed a door to something real. The Rosicrucians, if we are honest with ourselves, exist most fully not as a historical institution with membership rolls and archival records, but as a persistent question mark, written across centuries of human longing for hidden knowledge and spiritual transformation. What becomes striking, as the centuries unfold behind us now, is how little the absence of proof seemed to matter to those who believed. The order never answered the letters. No one ever definitively found the invisible college. The manifestos proved traceable, through careful scholarship, back to the earnest if opaque pen of Johann Valentin Andreae, a Protestant minister composing allegories in a war-torn German landscape. And yet the idea, the shimmering possibility that such a brotherhood existed somewhere, watching, gathering the wise, working in secret for the renewal of the world, this idea only grew more luminous in the darkness of silence. Perhaps this is the deepest truth about the Rosicrucians. They functioned as what we might call a mystery as method. Rather than a secret revealed, they were a secret that invited perpetual seeking. For those early readers in the 17th century, the very elusiveness of the order became its greatest proof. If such an enlightened brotherhood truly existed, of course it would not reveal itself to everyone. Of course it would test the sincerity of those who called out to it. Of course it would disappear the moment it was too openly pursued. The absence became a form of presence. The invisibility became a kind of visibility. And in this strange inversion lies something worth contemplating as your mind settles into stillness. We live in an age of total disclosure, of verified credentials and documented meetings, of social media trails and archived communications. Yet we are not necessarily more conscious of truth than those scholars who spent their lives in pursuit of something that may have been, to some degree, deliberately fictional. What if the structure of the mystery itself, the not knowing, the careful study of symbols, the patient decoding of texts, the community of seekers bound together by curiosity rather than initiation, what if this was the actual teaching? What if the order that was never found was always, in its way, inside those who looked for it? The historical record shows us something poignant. By the late 17th century, the Rosicrucian fervor had shifted shape. No longer was anyone seriously mapping expeditions to locate the physical headquarters of Christian Rosenkreuz. Instead, the symbols and ideas had begun to migrate into other vessels. Freemasonry, emerging as a formal structure in early 18th century England, borrowed the language of hidden wisdom and spiritual grades. The Golden and Rosy Cross in Germany adopted the Rose and Cross insignia and built layered systems of initiation around it. Much later, in the 20th century, organizations like the ancient mystical order Rosicrucians would claim lineage, sometimes explicitly, sometimes in the subtle grammar of symbolism, back to that moment in 1614, when a pamphlet slipped into the minds of Europe and suggested that perfection was possible, that transformation was not merely a religious promise, but a concrete possibility for those with eyes to see. But notice how the original remained beyond reach. The more the Rosicrucian impulse was codified into formal orders with hierarchies and fees and printed lessons, the further it seemed to move from the radical unknowability that first electrified it. The manifestos promised no membership, no clear ladder to climb, no curriculum to purchase. They promised only that somewhere, if you were worthy, if you listened carefully, if you lived with genuine spiritual hunger, you might be found. And that ambiguous hope, neither quite a lie nor quite a truth, proved far more durable than any organization could have been. The centuries have taught us something curious. Ideas, it seems, do not require proof to alter the shape of human consciousness. They simply require that they touch something true inside those who encounter them. The Rosicrucians offered their readers a particular vision, that wisdom was not confined to established churches or universities, that ancient knowledge from distant lands held real power, that transformation was possible for the individual seeker, that the natural world and the spiritual world interpenetrated, that silence and secrecy could be forms of respect rather than evasion. Whether or not such an order ever truly existed, these ideas carried weight. They shaped intellectual currents. They encouraged the study of alchemy and hermeticism during a period when such study might otherwise have been scorned. They created a framework in which women, in some cases, could participate in spiritual inquiry in ways that mainstream religion did not permit. And the mystery itself, the permanent uncertainty, the incompleteness, perhaps this too was a gift of sorts. Think of how differently the human mind engages with a closed system versus an open question. A closed system invites analysis, critique, eventual dismissal, but a question, genuinely open, invites instead a kind of patient wonder. It calls forth creativity. It allows each seeker to find something slightly different in the texts, to interpret the symbols according to their own evolving consciousness. The Rosicrucian manifestos, precisely because they were ambiguous and elusive and ultimately unresolved, gave every reader permission to become, in some sense, their own interpreter, their own initiator. The silence that fell over the Rosicrucian movement in the late 17th and 18th centuries was not, we might now see, a failure. It was a completion of a kind. The order had announced its existence and then vanished so thoroughly that it became eternal. It could never be definitively proven false because it had never been definitively pinned down as true. It lived in the space between history and legend, which is precisely the space where ideas most powerfully work their influence. As you rest now, with these reflections settling softly around you like pages of ancient manuscripts, consider what might draw us toward mystery itself. Why do we seek what hides? Why do the unanswered questions often matter more than the answered ones? The Rosicrucians, in their essential mystery, offer a kind of permission. They suggest that the pursuit of knowledge need not result in an institution, that the deepening of understanding is its own destination, that the most important answers may never arrive in words at all, but only in the quiet transformation of those who have looked long enough into the dark. The candlelit study where the manifestos were first copied and circulated is long gone. The scholars who stayed up late debating their authenticity have returned to dust. The seekers who sent letters into the void never received replies, but the questions they asked still echo. The symbols they studied still shimmer with significance. And somewhere in the fabric of Western thought, in art, in literature, in the secret hopes of those who still believe that hidden wisdom exists, the Rosicrucians remain, neither alive nor dead, neither found nor lost, exactly as they promised they would be. Let this quietness settle into you now. The long story of the invisible order has come to its gentle rest. And in that rest, in that peaceful uncertainty, perhaps you can find what so many seekers never could, not the answer to the mystery, but peace within it. The Rosicrucians, finally, did not vanish. They simply stopped insisting on their existence and became eternal in their absence. And that, perhaps, is the deepest magic of all.